Hey everyone, this is Jordan Last from Web Developer Training. So today we're going to learn about objects. Okay, last time we learned about primitive data types. Remember, the primitive data types cannot be broken down, and they are string, null, undefined, boolean, number, and symbol. And there are six of them. Always remember there are six of them. And remember that in JavaScript there are two main types of data: primitive and complex. These complex data types we call objects. So today we're going to learn a little bit about objects. Fundamentally, an object is a collection of properties, okay? Actually, let me change this. So object, collection of properties. What is a property? Property is a key value pair. What is a key? It's a name or an identifier, and it must be a string or a symbol. Luckily, we know what those are. And the value can be any data type. So let's reiterate this real quick. An object fundamentally is a collection of key value pairs. I don't know if JavaScript still implements objects under the hood with a hash map, but I believe it used to. And so you can think of it, if you know other programming languages, it is essentially a hash map where the keys are, well, but yeah, the keys are the hash, I believe, and then that maps to a value. Yes, and so in this way, and let's step back a little bit. So the keys, they must be strings or symbols, but those keys can map to or correspond to a value of any type, including an object, which is excellent because now you can start creating arbitrarily complex data structures. So let's go through some examples. So let's make an example object. So I'm going to make a variable here. So I'm going to use the const keyword and then a space. And my variable's name is going to be object1. So I type object1 and I say equals, okay? To create an object, and remember there are multiple ways to create an object. I'm going to go over the ones that I personally use as I'm developing and the ones I think are simplest and best. And, you know, I'm obviously biased. There are multiple ways to do these things. There are trade-offs to them, but I'm going to focus, I guess, on what I think is the simplest, most effective path here. And, you know, if we want to get into way more details than we can in other videos. So object1 equals, and then on the right-hand side of the equal sign, I'm going to use two curly braces, an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace, or maybe you could say a left curly brace and a right curly brace. This creates what we call an object literal. It's like a string literal or a number literal or a null literal or an undefined literal. They all the types have their literals, except I don't believe symbol has a literal because it's actually a function that you call. But the object also has a literal, and it's two curly braces, okay? An opening and a closing. Now, inside the curly braces, I like to just make a new line and indent for each of my properties. But inside the curly braces, we're now going to put our properties. So the first property I'm going to call prop1. So I just type prop1, and then I use a colon, and I'll put the value of prop1, which I'll just say is the number 1. So notice that, yeah, we have one property. Const object1 equals opening curly on a new line, tabbed over, prop1, colon, the number 1. Another new line, and a closing curly brace and a semicolon. So let's dive into this real quick. We have one property. The name of the property is prop1. So the left-hand side of the colon is prop1. This is the name. This is the key, you could say. This is the identifier. Technically, under the hood, it's going to be converted into a string. But notice we actually didn't write a string literal. We wrote more of a keyword, you could say. I could also wrap prop1 in single quotes if I wanted, or double quotes if I wanted, or I believe tactics. Well, actually, let's see. Property assignment. Backticks actually might not work, which is kind of interesting. Let's actually test it out. So object one, backticks. So I'm going to use Node.js to actually run this program, and I'm going to see if it actually throws an error. Principles, objects, object. Oh. So it looks like you can't actually use backticks, so you can't use template strings when you're creating the keys for an object, which is interesting. I did not know that. So anyways, prop1 : 1. So let's make another property. Prop2 : 2. Now notice the right-hand side, that's where we put the value. And so far, both of these properties are numbers. So let's make prop3 something else. Let's make it a string. This is prop3. Pretty cool. And we can go on and on with all of the data types that we know of. Prop4 is null. Prop5 is undefined. Okay. Now let's do something special with prop6. Remember, the value of a property can be a complex data type, or as we say, an object. So if I use opening closing curlies, I can create an object. Prop6 is now an object, and inside of prop6, I can create my own properties again, and I can give them different values. So prop6, which is an object, has a property called prop1, which is the number 56. Prop2, which I'll make null, and prop3, I'll just make it an empty object. And notice, prop3 could go on as well. So in prop6, so prop6 is an object which has a property called prop3, which now has a property called prop1, and its value is a string, hello there. In my opinion, this is the simplest way to create an object. Now, might be a little confusing because depending on the language that you're working with, depending on if you're going for an object-oriented programming, objects have a slightly different connotation. Objects in those cases still have properties or members, which they have names and they have values. But also in object-oriented programming languages, your objects will have methods or functions. And we haven't gotten to functions yet, but remember, a function is an object. And so if I wanted to add a function or a method, they're essentially the same thing. A method is a function that's associated with an object, you could say. Prop7 could be a function if I wanted to. And now this object is turning more into an object that you might use in object-oriented programming. But we're not going to get into that today. And I recommend, for the most part, that you keep your objects as plain data objects. A plain data object just has properties where the values are either primitive data types or other plain data objects. Which essentially, I guess I was kind of self-referential in a way, but plain data object isn't going to have a method on it that somehow manipulates the object itself. Probably won't even have a method on it at all. So when I pass data around, when I'm doing the stuff that I do, I try to keep all my objects as plain data objects. It keeps things simple. And then you can have separate places where you create functions that will consume or take those plain data objects as inputs, and then we'll manipulate them somehow and then return a new object with the changes that you wanted. Or that function will take that object and send it to the database, or write it to a file, or display it on the screen or something. So what we're talking about right now is plain data objects. Objects that there's, depending on the language, there are different ways to think about it. Okay, so that's kind of like just a basic example, but it's not very practical. This might not even make sense. Let's start to construct something. So I'm gonna push down object 1 and create a new object. Let's call it car. Okay. So I made a variable called car and I assigned it to an empty object literal. So now let's start thinking about this. So we can now start modeling the real world. It's not going to be perfect, but this is how we're going to as we're creating applications and solutions to real world problems, we're going to need to model the real world in the digital world that we're creating. So in our car object, let's think of a few properties. So an easy one is like the color of the car. Let's just make our car red. So I created a property called color. Its value is the string red. Let's see. Maybe it's like manual or automatic. Or no, let's see. Transmission type might be interesting to know. I'll make it a string called manual. And I put that string in all caps because it's kind of like a constant value. So it's the convention to make constants in all caps. So the transmission type, the key is transmission type, the value is manual. Okay. Let's see. Color, transmission type. Okay, maybe we could have num doors. So this will be a 4-door car. Let's see. Sunroof, we could just say, you either have a sunroof or you don't. So in this car, I'll say the sunroof is false. And let's do one more. Let's do wheels. Now in this case, I'm going to introduce what's called an array. It's just a list. You use square brackets, an opening square bracket and a closed square bracket. And then you can put in here values separated by commas. And an array is a special type of object that, like I said, is just a list. And even under the hood, it may have changed since last I studied it, but under the hood, arrays are very similar to objects, but their keys are all numbers, essentially. So, and I don't know if those numbers are actually implemented as strings or if they're actually numbers, but yeah, who knows? But the point is, the first element, its key is going to be 0. The second element, its key is going to be 1. The third element, its key is going to be 2. So for our wheels, I want to actually put a couple wheels in here as objects themselves. So I'm going to actually go up here and I'm going to say wheel 1, wheel 2. I created 2 new objects. I actually created them outside of the car object, and then I'm going to reference them inside the wheels property. So wheel 1, let's say the number of hex nuts, 6. Wheel 2 is going to be the same, 6 hex nuts. And then I'll say like max PSI, 40. Wheel 2, these are going to be exactly the same. So, and then if I go down into my wheels property in the car object, I'm going to say that it has wheel 1 and wheel 2. And actually, all the wheels on this car are going to be the same. So I'm just going to make one wheel object. And the wheels property will just have 4 of these. 3, 4. Okay, so now our car object has 5 properties. The first property is color, it's red. The second property is transmission type, manual. The third property is num doors, 4, sunroof, false, and then wheels. And wheels is actually an object, which is actually an array. And there are 4 wheel objects as members of that array. And I created a wheel object outside of the car object, and each wheel has 6 hex nuts and a max PSI of 40. Now, let me format this array a little bit better here. I like to put each element on a new line if my array is going to be, I don't have any significant number of elements. And I want to show you an alternative way of doing this. I didn't have to put each wheel object into a variable like that. What I actually could have done is I could have put each of the wheels in here directly if I really wanted to. But because they're all the same, it is nice to actually put them into a variable. So I could also do something like this. And we could go on and on. The wheels, now each hex nut in a wheel could be its own object. And who knows what a hex nut, it could have the metal type or the alloy that it's using. It could have the place of manufacture. It could have the max torque allowed. And, maybe the max torque itself could be an object. And, well, I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but like you can see, you can break things down with arbitrary complexity, arbitrary levels. I know another cool way to think about it would be, I'll just throw it in. Make a new object called the human body. So we could think of the human body, think of its major systems. So the nervous system is going to be an object. So I'll just make an empty object literal for now. The respiratory system would be an empty object here. The cardiovascular system. Let's see, I don't know, skeletal system. We just stop there. So our human body right now just has 4 properties: nervous system, respiratory system, cardiovascular system, and skeletal system. Notice how we're mapping the real world as best we can. And we're only mapping, we're creating plain data objects. So we're only mapping, kind of static data, things, just properties, just attributes of things. And the actual functionality will come later when we learn about functions, because when we learn about functions and operators, which are almost the same thing. Functions and operators allow you to actually take objects as input and somehow operate on them, somehow do something to them, which is going to get to the meat of how we actually build things, right? But understanding objects, understanding how you can create arbitrarily complex data structures, and understanding how you can map the real world into these plain data objects is absolutely fundamental. And let me think if there's anything else that we should cover here. And I mean, hopefully it's obvious. Like, we can go into the nervous system and start adding properties. Go into the respiratory system, add properties, cardiovascular and skeletal system, and add the properties that we need. Yeah, I feel like that is generally a good high-level overview of the basics of objects. And, if we miss something, if you have questions, let me know, and we can make subsequent videos to try to understand this in more detail. But thanks for watching.